Thanks for coming tonight. This is the final lecture in the 2012 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. For those folks who have enjoyed the lectures this spring, we do this every spring, so we'll have it again next year. For students who are taking it for credit, you can take this course for credit for up to 3 credits. So you can take it 2 more times if you would like. We usually pick our topics in the fall, so if you're interested in knowing what next year's topic's going to be, feel free to get a hold of me at the Wilderness Institute in the College of Forestry in the fall semester. Just another housekeeping announcement. The other big program that the Wilderness Institute does is the Wilderness and Civilization program, which is a program that gives students at the University of Montana a wilderness studies minor if they're enrolled in the program. It's limited to 25 students every year. This is one of the required courses for the program. It's a field and campus-based program at the University of Montana. It's offered every fall semester, and we're currently still accepting applications. Applications are due, however, on April 1st, which for most of you means Friday because April 1st is spring break. So if you're interested or we're planning on applying for the program, make sure to have your applications in by the end of the week, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about that. All right, so I hope you have enjoyed this semester. I've had a really great time learning with all of you as we've listened to all of our speakers talk about these various issues and stories surrounding our broad topic of water. Just to recap, so far this semester we've learned about the legal basis for water rights on Native American lands. We've traveled to the Middle East to learn about water conflict resolution and how sitting next to someone can sometimes be enough to stop an argument, even one that ensues over a large issue such as water resources. We heard a personal story about the Clark Fork River here in Missoula from a local author. We learned about imperiled river systems across the world from an environmental advocate and what is being done to protect them. We traveled to Asia with a fly fishing guide to learn about conservation efforts through business design and development. We heard about environmental cleanup efforts on remote Alaska shorelines, places that would otherwise be unknown and unspoiled, however are facing some pretty tremendous environmental issues due to changing weather patterns and ocean currents. We heard about invasive species in our western waters, why we work so hard to keep them there, and what they've done to many of our ecosystems. And last week we heard how water shapes the landscapes through which we might adventure, and how traveling through those landscapes might mean that sometimes you float for days, and other times you carry a 300-pound kayak up and down ice floes. So tonight we come home from the frozen north of the Canadian Arctic to hear about the river running through our metaphorical and in many cases literal backyards. The Clark Fork watershed that we're going to be hearing about tonight drains nearly the entire western portion of Montana, and over a third of Montana's population lives within the Clark Fork watershed. This was actually something I just learned, but by volume, the Clark Fork River is actually the largest river in Montana. On an average year for the Clark Fork River, its water flow is the same volume of water as the Colorado River is in a wet year. The Colorado is a pretty big river. It irrigates and supports our agricultural lands. It gives us a recreational habitat. It provides moments of respite on hot August days, as I found this fall when I moved here. And the reason why I chose this as the final capstone talk in our lecture series is because I wanted to bring home everything that we've talked about throughout the lecture series. All these different stories that we've heard and issues we've talked about through all of our other speakers can be kind of summarized tonight as we look at the watershed and the river that's so close to us and right here in our own town. So tonight's talk will cover, hopefully, many of the ideas that we've talked about over the course of the semester, with a focus on the water that dominates our local landscape. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Christine Brick. She's the Science Director for the Clark Fork Coalition. The Clark Fork Coalition is a river restoration group based in Missoula, Montana, and they're dedicated to protecting and restoring the Clark Fork watershed. Chris holds degrees in geology and environmental studies and a PhD that focused on the geochemistry and hydrology of the Clark Fork River. In past lives, she's been a mining geologist, an environmental consultant, and for many years an educator, teaching classes right here at the University of Montana. She served on the board of directors for the Clark Fork Coalition for years before being asked to be the science director for the organization. Tonight, her talk is going to focus on the Upper Clark Fork watershed from its headwaters in Butte to the community in Milltown, discussing the ongoing restoration of the Clark Fork River. Let's welcome Christine to our lecture series.
Thank you all, and I will echo Natalie to say thank you for coming on a beautiful, almost spring evening. I am talking about the Clark Fork, as Natalie said, and we're trying to figure out what it is going to take to make it clean, healthy, and whole. There is this huge Superfund process, but I guess my point here tonight is that that by itself isn't enough. So this is our watershed, for those of you who perhaps are less familiar with it. It drains, as Natalie said, most of western Montana. Waters rise from the Continental Divide at the headwaters, flow out to Lake Pend Oreille, and eventually to the Columbia River. It is the largest by volume, and it's made up of iconic sub-watersheds, namely, the Blackfoot, the Bitterroot, the Middle and Lower Clark Fork, and also the Flathead. And if you think about some of these most scenic tributaries, the Flathead, the Blackfoot, the Bitterroot, they all have wilderness at their headwaters. Wilderness is where we get our cleanest, best water, typically. The Upper Clark Fork, on the other hand, doesn't really have that. We have maybe a little bit coming off of the Anaconda-Pintler Wilderness outside of Anaconda, but most of that drains south, not into the Clark Fork. We have a little bit, we have a little mountain island here in the Flint Creek Range, but for the most part, the Clark Fork is affected by a lot of activity at its headwaters, at its very headwaters in Butte. I've got multiple little clickers here. So we are going to focus tonight, as I said, on the Upper Clark Fork, which is this. So again, for geography, we're down here in Missoula. Butte is up here. Silverbow Creek runs from the headwaters. Silverbow Creek is the headwaters in Butte, goes to Warm Springs Ponds, joins with Warm Springs Creek, and becomes the Clark Fork, which then heads downstream to Milltown. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so not only are we going to focus on the Upper Clark Fork, but we're going to focus on the upper part of the Upper Clark Fork, because this is the area that had really the most damage and has the biggest story right now. So once upon a time, Silverbow Creek was the place where the Salish went, and it was known, the name of the place was known as the place where you shoot them in the head. And what they were talking about were bull trout. The bull trout were so thick in Silverbow Creek that the Salish could shoot them with a bow and arrow, and it was one of the best places to harvest them. And a description, the creek got its name. In the Anaconda paper, prospectors initially described it and said, "With the water gleaming like silver in the brilliant sun was the creek, bending and twisting as it hunted the easiest way down the valley. The creek made a wide bend to the north, and along the center of the valley led an Indian trail. It looked like a silver bow." Sadly, that didn't last. At the turn of the century, or actually before the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, gold and then silver were discovered in Silverbow Creek and on Butte Hill, and prospectors came to Butte in droves. And it didn't take long before the focus shifted from gold and silver to copper. That was about the time that electricity was new. People wanted copper for wire. World War I was kicking in later, a little bit later in the earliest 1900s. And the town became known as the richest hill on earth. By 1885, there were about 1,800 dues-paying members of a general union in Butte. So Butte was in full swing long before the turn of that century. And in fact, it peaked in the 1920s. So it wasn't only mining in Butte, but it was also smelting in Anaconda, just downstream from Butte. Ore was shipped, smelted, roasted. A lot of that stuff went up in the air, spread out from airfall onto soils in the valley. And of course, the waste from the smelter went into the creek. But mining wasn't the only impact. I mean, we think of the mines as being and metals as being the major impact in the Upper Clark Fork. But think about what you needed to support the mines. Oh, actually, before I get to that, Silverbow Creek became an industrial sewer. And what we're looking at here is the range in the background is the Continental Divide. You see that same view as you're driving to Butte today. And this is the Butte Reduction Works, and this is Silverbow Creek, which is where tailings are sluiced out onto the floodplain and they're just being decanted into the creek. So the creek has now changed from a beautiful silver bow to an industrial sewer. Okay, so back to what the mines needed. Oops, they needed timber. And this looks like a log yard, but it's actually the Blackfoot River. So the timbers were needed for the mines to keep the adits and the shafts open, and timber was also needed for fuel. And so, probably untold thousands of board feet were cut about this time. This is just the Blackfoot. A lot of this, there's a sawmill at the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork, built by William A. Clark, and he floated logs to that sawmill, and those logs were sawn into timbers for the mine. William A. Clark also built a dam to power that sawmill, and that was, of course, the Milltown Dam, which is just 5 or 7 miles upstream from us here in Missoula. So it's a timber crib dam. As you can see down here, it was made of a lattice of timbers, which they then filled with rock. And this is Clark's Dam, otherwise known as the Milltown Dam. So the stage is set now for sort of the singular event in the Clark Fork watershed, and that was the flood of 1908. This is the largest flood of record on the Clark Fork. The discharge was 48,000 CFS, which in comparison, an average high flow year for us at this site would be about 9,000 CFS, a little over 9. So this is more than 5 times what sort of an average flood year would be. And it hasn't been repeated since. But this was important because this flood carried millions of cubic yards of contaminated waste, all those tailings that you saw outside the Butte Reduction Works, plus tailings outside the smelters in Anaconda, all the way downstream to Milltown Dam and beyond. I mean, you can see there's a lot of water going over the dam. There's slower water behind it, so a lot of the fines dropped out, but not all of it. This was really the major pathway by which most of the mining wastes were distributed in the Clark Fork and spread throughout the basin. So everywhere where there was a backwater, everywhere where the torrent might have slowed down a little bit, you can expect some deposition of mining waste. It's definitely worst at the headwaters. As you can imagine, the worst of the stuff settled out there, became cleaner as you moved downstream, but not very clean. This is the damage. And what you see in the upper part of the screen here is the Silverbow Creek floodplain. And you can see the creek just cuts through what looks like essentially pure mine tailings, and it pretty much is. And this is what some of those mine tailings look like close up in the summertime. They're blue from copper. The Clark Fork 5, the metals and arsenic that are most prevalent in this material include, of course, arsenic, copper, lead, cadmium, and zinc. So as you can imagine, nothing much grows here. It's toxic to plants because not only are the metals concentrations high, but the soils are very acidic. So this is again on the Silverboat Creek floodplain. This is not snow, and those are not really polar bears. That was last week's talk. Sorry. It's white, actually, from, again, those metal salts that accumulate on the floodplain. And this is the floodplain of Silverboat Creek, just to give you an idea of the scope of it from ground level. So again, those are metal salts that contain, a lot of them are copper, calcium sulfates, but they contain copper, zinc, cadmium. This is what it looks like on the Clark Fork River. By the time it got a little bit further downstream, what happens is that these pure tailings mix with the sediment, and so it's a little bit more heterogeneous. You have some patches that are a little cleaner, you have some areas of pure tailings, but it's just a little more mixed up. So this nice blue water here demonstrates the copper content of these soils. You can see the crumbly tailings next to the stream itself, which is kind of a problem. Likewise, you see these blue salts accumulated here. Notice this berm. We'll talk about that a bit later. But the issue with the tailings is that in the summertime, when it would be really hot and really dry, any soil moisture that was in those tailings would wick toward the surface, and it would evaporate. And so that solution was usually some sort of a copper sulfate solution, and then when it precipitated, you got these copper minerals. Well, they precipitate easily, and they also dissolve easily. So when it rains, this stuff would dissolve instantly and wash into the river. So that's part of the reason why these berms were built up, was to prevent this stuff from washing directly into the river. And if you look at an aerial perspective, what you see is that it is a mix. There are areas here, these white areas are fairly barren, and those are tailings, but the areas in between have some vegetation that is still at some level in decent shape, probably because you've got tailings mixed with cleaner material, so it isn't quite as toxic. So between, I believe it was 1983 and 1992, there were 8 major fish kills on the Clark Fork River that were observed. And until those temporary berms were constructed. In that last picture, I showed you the little berm next to the river. They finally wised up and built some of those along the river, so at least this stuff wouldn't go directly into the stream. But until that time, there was roughly 1 major fish kill a year, where there would just be trout belly up. And finally, it wasn't immediately obvious to everybody exactly why that was happening until some enterprising scientists from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks managed to get out there right when a thunderstorm was occurring, and they took some water samples. So they could see that there was a fish kill occurring. They got out there and started collecting water, and the x-axis here, minutes from the start of the thunderstorm. And what you can see is that the pH goes from 7.8, which is neutral, down to about 4.2, which is really acidic. So if you're a fish, you're happily swimming along in water, neutral water, fairly reasonable water, and within 20 minutes, it's as if you're swimming in vinegar. So a big shock to the ecosystem. So the red line there is pH. That's the one that we're looking at here. They also sampled for metal. Let's just take a look at the orange line, which is the copper concentration. We've got the same axis on the bottom, which is minutes from the start of the thunderstorm. But the other thing to notice here, and I'm not sure how visible it is that the y-axis is copper concentration. It's in parts per billion, micrograms per liter, and it's in thousands. The other thing to notice here is that the acute aquatic life standard for copper is about 25 parts per billion. So these fish that 20 minutes ago were swimming in reasonable water are now swimming in water that's acidic as vinegar, and it also has copper concentrations that are 500 times the aquatic life standard. So it's no wonder at all that fish went belly up in droves. So So they managed to build these berms and cut back on the number of fish kills, but that doesn't mean that the fishery has exactly recovered in the Clark Fork. There's still 1/5 roughly the number of fish in the upper Clark Fork compared to Montana, compared to similar Montana streams. Compare it to the Ruby River, compare it to areas in the Big Hole that are about the same size as the Clark Fork. The Clark Fork's about 1/5 of what it should be. Okay, so meantime, downstream, without people really connecting this to Butte or Anaconda, arsenic was discovered in groundwater in 1981. And somebody in this area of Milltown, right here, had some bad tasting water in their wells. And so they asked the county sanitarian to come out and collect a sample. So they did, and they analyzed it for sort of everything, and they found 500 and roughly 510 parts per billion of arsenic. And the drinking water standard at the time was 50, now it's 10. And their initial reaction was, oh, that has to be a mistake. So they went back and resampled it, and it was no mistake. And so then they started trying to figure out where the arsenic came from, because, I mean, look at Milltown Reservoir. Does it look like a Superfund site? I took a Russian scientist up on the bluff once, and I said, this is our Superfund site. And he said, you don't know what a Superfund site is. This doesn't look like a Superfund site. But two professors from the University of Montana, Department of Geosciences, Bill Wissner and Johnny Moore, started taking samples, started drilling through the ice in the reservoir, winter at the time, and collecting samples of those reservoir sediments, and measured groundwater flow direction, figured out that in fact that's where the arsenic was coming from, was from comes and goes there, from this area of sediments within the reservoir were highly contaminated, and consequently it was declared a Superfund site. So they drilled a bunch of wells, mapped out the plume, and this yellow line, well, first of all, let's orient ourselves here. The dam is here. This is the Blackfoot River here, the Clark Fork River coming up this way, and the red line is the area of contaminated sediment. That's where the floodwaters slowed in 1908. So that's where most of the worst stuff dropped out of solution, because the floodwaters were slowing down. The dam was there, it held, but it did slow floodwaters a little bit, and a lot of the sediment backed up behind the dam. The yellow line is the area of contaminated groundwater. Of course, the other impact of the dam, and this is kind of a funny picture, but we're looking down the spillway of the dam, and what we see is this really dark stuff here. Those are fish. So they're all lined up at the dam. Fish from upstream, they spawn upstream, they come down, they can make it down through the dam, but when it came time to swim back to spawning grounds, they couldn't make it back up. So we lost fish population simply because of the dam blocking access to tributary spawning grounds. Okay, Superfund designation. This occurred in the Clark Fork in the early to mid 80s, and various pieces were declared at various times. The communities of Butte and Anaconda, Milltown, and eventually the upper Clark Fork River, eventually the Clark Fork River all the way from Warm Springs Ponds to Milltown, all became Superfund sites. And there's this great line from a movie that came out in like 2000, I think, Traffic. I don't know if you've seen it. But it's just this throwaway line where the husband and wife are talking, and the husband says, "Oh, how's your day?" And the wife says, "Oh, Superfund. Whenever you say that word, people just stop paying attention." So I promise this is the only slide that I have, was just a brief primer on Superfund. Basically, it's federal law whereby the polluter pays. ARCO in 1977, I believe it was, acquired the Anaconda Copper Company which is probably one of the worst business decisions in history, because they, shortly after they acquired the company, the Superfund law was passed and they acquired the liability as well as the company. They've probably spent on the order of $500 million, Bree, correct me if I'm wrong, on cleanup so far. There may be more to come. The other part of Superfund, which is interesting, is the Natural Resource Damage Program, and that's the third point, the third bullet point. States can sue the responsible party, which in this case is ARCO, for natural resource damages. And so those proceeds go to restoration above and beyond what Superfund can do. That's about $200 million. So just to give an example, at Milltown, Superfund paid for removing the waste. If all we had was Superfund, the river would be put back into a rock-lined ditch. It's the restoration that pays for the natural channel. Okay, so that is part of the Superfund program. This is our map of the Superfund area. So as you can see, it's all of these sort of highlighted, colored areas are the extent of the Superfund area. Large areas around Butte. This is Silverbow Creek here. All this area around Anaconda and the Warm Springs Ponds. And then down the river to Garrison is the worst part, but it continues down to Milltown. So let's start up at Silverbow Creek. This is something that I think as Missoulians we sometimes don't pay as much attention to, but it's an amazing story. They're still working on cleaning up Silverbow Creek. They started in 1999, should be finished in a couple of years here. So far they've removed 4.2 million cubic yards. This green area is the area where they've done removals. It's a little hard to see, but there are sort of tan areas that are left to go. But they're getting close. They've done about 85% of the removal and about 13 miles of stream rebuilt and restored. That's only about half done. They're actually taking what was formerly a 20-mile stream, and it will be 30 miles by the time they're done because they're adding meanders. And these wastes are going as well to this repository. If I can, oops, I always hit the wrong button here. This repository, the outside of Opportunity. So just a few quick pictures of before and after. This is an area of Silverbow Creek, actually one of the areas that is not quite as much of a wasteland as some of those previous pictures I showed you. A little bit of vegetation, but I'll still see there's a lot of barren area. And so during construction, they essentially took out the whole floodplain. They didn't just sort of reorganize this dirt. They took it all the way out, and they rebuilt the floodplain with clean material from scratch. And that pretty much means that they had to go find clean material, mine it from somewhere else, and bring it in. So this is where they, oops. Well, I may or may not, there we go. This is where they rerouted the creek. This is where they're actually rebuilding the creek here. And this is 4 years after in this same location. A little bit more of a close-up view, but you can see it's coming back reasonably well. And remember the picture with the polar bear that was white, kind of looked like snow? This is the same area, slightly different vantage point. We're looking towards the creek instead of towards the floodplain. But that's the same area. And so it's fairly amazing, but life comes back. And in fact, in 2012, there are fishing regulations for Silverbow Creek. And so you're thinking, well, okay, great, but why is this slide up here? It's because this is the first time there have ever been fishing regulations on Silverbow Creek. I mean, it's been dead for over 100 years. The joke amongst kids in Butte was that they would go to the store and you could get those Idaho farm trout, in packages, whole trout. I mean, they take them home, take them out of the wrapper, take them home and say, hey, look what I caught in the creek. And their parents would be like, yeah, right. We know that didn't come from the creek. And so within, actually, they started in 1999, and within years, I mean, it took a while. Bugs started coming back. The project manager on Silverbow Creek would get these phone calls from residents in the area who would say, "What are you guys doing down there? Because all of a sudden I've got mosquitoes and I've got flies." So they're used to an ecosystem that was really completely dead. There was nothing in Silverbow Creek. And so the fact that it's come back to the point where there are now not only fish, but native fish. The first fish to come through were sort of suckers and shiners and some of those smaller species, but now there are brook trout and cutthroat trout at the level where, for the first time ever, there are fishing regulations. And this is a cutthroat from Silverbow Creek. This is the son of the director of the Clark Fork Watershed Education Program. He's been fishing down there for a while. And it's a pretty neat story because, this guy's dad certainly wasn't fishing here when he was that age. It's only been within the last probably couple of years. Once it started, it happened fast. And it's not just all about fish. I mean, apart from fish, there are now osprey, there are heron, there are mink, there are otter, all of the species that, that prey on fish and others. So that's one end of the watershed. Let's take a look at the end of the watershed now that's closest to us here in Missoula, and that is the Milltown site. That cleanup started in 2006, so a little after Silverbow Creek, and I just have a few pictures. This is the demolition of the powerhouse. I'm not really going through the whole reasons for why the decision was made. It was actually kind of a contentious decision at the time. It seems so obvious now in retrospect, but by 2006 the dam was on its way out. And in 2008, the two rivers, the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork, were connected for the first time in 100 years. And within 2 weeks, the first radio-tagged trout was found swimming upstream through the confluence. So what we're looking at here is the powerhouse breach here. And a year later, this is the spillway. A year later, the spillway was gone as well. And this is the area of contaminated sediments that was removed. This is the former Clark Fork channel here. This is the bypass channel here. The picture is taken from the bluff, which is now made into a park and is almost finished. And that's easy to access off the Deer Creek Road. If you haven't already been up there, it's a great view of the whole site. So sediment was removed from that removal area. It took 2 years. 1 train a day, 7 days a week, total of 2.2 million cubic yards. It's a lot of dirt to move, but at Silverbow Creek they've removed roughly twice that and they're still going. So the material was loaded onto trains, hauled upstream, and again, all of the waste, for the most part, not 100% of it, but most of it is being consolidated in a former tailings repository for the Anaconda smelter, and that's just outside the town of Opportunity. This is what it looked like in the fall. So the restoration is almost complete. They're going to be doing a little bit more work. In fact, they've started doing some dirt moving here. There's equipment out there now sort of grading this back, and they will also be doing some park construction there, putting in trails, I think putting in a parking lot, putting in a river access so you'll be able to put your boat and your tubes in there and float down through Missoula. They still need to do some re-veg over here where the bypass channel was. That's not completely finished yet. So there's a few little odds and ends that are happening this spring and summer. We're hoping the rivers will be open by maybe late summer or fall. Not sure yet. We may have to wait till 2013, but it'll be worth it. So Milltown is still raw. It's still not quite, as you can see from the picture in the fall, it hasn't all, the vegetation hasn't all come back yet. We're still waiting to see what it looks like this spring because I think it will be a lot greener. But there has been progress. You know, for one, fish can now access spawning grounds in the Blackfoot and the Upper Clark Fork. And it's all fish, it's not just trout. You know, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks monitors trout. They have radio tagged fish that they monitor. But there's been a report of more eagles than usual up in the Upper Clark Fork. And I went to a conference where I heard a fisheries biologist talking about this, and he said, you know, we tend to just look at trout. But if you think of the volume of fish that are really in the river, if you think of the biomass in the river, there are tens of thousands of these other fish that we never monitor. I mean, things like, you know, shiners, dace, suckers, minnows, northern pike minnows, you know, a broad range of species, both native and non-native. And that's all eagle food. So it may be that, you know, the proliferation of eagles that we've been seeing in the Upper Clark Fork may be a function of the fact that the fish can now migrate more readily upstream. So when the dam was breached, there's definitely a short-term hit to aquatic life, to the macroinvertebrates, and to the fish, primarily between Milltown and the Bitterroot River, where some of the diluting water of the Bitterroot helped. But by 2010 and certainly by 2011, everything had bounced back. It had bounced back and then some. And so bug populations are back to where they were, fish populations are back to where they were. And for groundwater, which is the reason EPA made this a Superfund site to begin with, because EPA doesn't really care about fish passage. That's not a toxic, it's not a pollutant, that's not their deal. And the reason they made it a Superfund site was because of the contaminated groundwater. So of the 9 monitoring wells that they used to track progress, 2 of them are already drinkable. And these are wells that had extremely high levels of arsenic in them. 3 of those wells are nearly there, and 4 are the same or improving. And so it's pretty amazing because, you know, groundwater, you'd expect it to clean up on the order of decades, not so much on the order of a couple of years. So progress is definitely happening. So these 2 bookend projects are, I think, major successes. But the river between remains. And what I'm talking about in particular is this river between Warm Springs Ponds and Garrison Junction. So Highway 12 there, that's the road to Helena if you're on I-90. So it's the river sort of before you get to Anaconda. And the cleanup here is going to be different than it was. You can expect it to be a little bit more surgical than either Silverbow Creek or Milltown, partly because the wastes are more mixed with clean material. So it probably won't be we probably won't see as much whole-scale removal as we did for those other 2 projects. But on the other hand, we don't know because it hasn't totally been decided yet. The agencies are still fighting over what the cleanup is going to look like, and the plan is not yet set in stone. So we're still working to make sure that we see a good, solid cleanup in the upper river. But this really is the part of the part of the river that I want to talk about the most, because I think this is the area that has the most potential. And this is the area where we really need to go beyond what Superfund and what these restoration funds get us. So just a few little pictures to show sort of what the cleanup might, you know, sort of beginning and what it might look like afterwards. So we've got these crumbling banks full of tailings here, and they need to look more like this. So there are areas of the Clark Fork that look like this now, but it's these areas that need to be fixed. And so the ones that are contaminated like that can be removed, they can be rebuilt, and they can be revegetated. Likewise, for these slicken areas, which is what the ranchers call them, which are areas devoid of any vegetation, they can also be removed and replaced, or they could be treated in place and then revegetated. And this is an area where that's occurred. So we don't know yet exactly what the exact method will be, but it will be one of those, some combination of those 2 rather. So you're thinking, okay, that sounds good. We can replicate the successes that we saw at Silverbow Creek and at Milltown, just add another $100 million and let's go. But this one is really different. It's not the same, and it's going to be trickier. The biggest difference is that this Superfund site in the Upper Clark Fork is all owned by individuals. It's mostly family ranches. So it's, you know, for every mile or two of river that EPA wants to clean up, they're going to have to make it work for the landowners, because the landowners hold the key to success on this project. If they're not willing to maintain it, once it's cleaned up, you know, EPA can come on. I mean, they can, you know, they have the authority to come onto their land, clean it up, but maintenance is still going to be critical. And so buy-in from the families in this watershed is so important. Because of that, we decided we needed a little skin in the game, and we had an opportunity to buy a ranch. And so our ranch is on the Upper Clark Fork River. It's between Galen and Racetrack. We have roughly 3.5 miles of Superfund site, of river frontage. And we're into it because we want to create a learning site, not just for us, and well, for us it's pretty important, but also for other people in the valley. And so, you know, we're not sure exactly how Superfund cleanup is really going to fit with a ranching operation. I mean, you know, backhoes and cows, I mean, how is that going to work? And so we need to figure that out too. And so if we have this property, we can try to figure out, we can help others try to figure out how it's going to work on their land. So beyond Superfund, what does restoration look like? And this is the part of our work where we're trying to dovetail with Superfund, but it's not Superfund by itself, and it's not the restoration money. We're getting off the main stem. The reason in a valley like this where you need to look beyond the main stem river is that the tributaries have some impacts too. They're not impacts from mining, but there may be areas where culverts block fish passage, where there's no fish habitat, where streams are completely dry because of irrigation. So the question is, how do you fix that? Because fish don't just live in a main stem river. They need tributaries for spawning, for rearing of young, for other parts of their life cycles. If they don't have those tributaries, they're not going to live in the main stem. And so no tributaries means you're not going to have a healthy fishery or a healthy ecosystem in the main part of the river. So for the tributaries, we need to restore them. And restoration in this case means rewatering, reconnecting, and revegetating. And so there are restoration opportunities. I tend to like to think of it that way. This is the Upper Clark Fork again. That blue star is our ranch. This is Silverbow Creek here, Opportunity, Anaconda, and Deer Lodge is up here at the north end of the map. And so these are all the tributaries. And this map is up here to show you where the native trout strongholds are. They tend to not be in the main stem of the river. They're mostly up on the forest lands. Water is colder there. And so they're isolated from each other. There are numerous fish barriers. So again, fish can't make it from the main stem up into the tributaries. And there are dewatered streams. And the main stem itself is dewatered. Okay, so it's hard to make a living for a fish if you don't have water. So for rewatering, this is Lower Racetrack Creek in August of 2010. And it's dry. You know, some streams go dry in the summer naturally. This one doesn't though. This one is dry because all of its water is taken for irrigation. And there are a number of users, but we were able to broker an agreement with one of the biggest water users on this creek, whereby we were able to acquire some of his water rights from Racetrack Lake, which is at the headwaters of this creek. And in return, the rancher who sold the water rights was able to put in a more efficient pivot system. Oops. This just shows, to give you some idea of the way we distribute water on the landscape in agricultural areas. This blue line in the middle is Racetrack Creek, the creek I just showed you. This is the Clark Fork, so it's flowing into the Clark Fork. And all those little red lines, those are ditches. And they're maybe not all being used now, some of them are historic, but it shows the extent to which we change the hydrology of a basin by moving water out of streams and across the landscape into these ditches. And so this is what Racetrack Creek looked like in August of 2011 after we were able to release lake water for the creek. So this will now be an annual event where we can keep the creek watered in late summer when it would normally go dry. So Racetrack Creek in the past has been a bull trout stronghold. It may be again. Reconnecting is important too. This is, irrigation tends to put up a lot of barriers to fish. This is the Coors Manning ditch. And this particular structure would need to be fixed. And you know, the fixes aren't that hard. It's just that ranchers tend not to have a lot of money or a lot of time to put into it. They have water rights. They can do this. And if they just have partners to work with, they're not necessarily averse to fixing something like this. It's just a matter of, you know, helping them find the right funding sources. And again, this is another way you can reconnect streams. This is putting a fish screen on a ditch. You know, if you get lots of fish end up entrained in ditches because they flow from the creek down through a head gate into a ditch, and they end up high and dry on somebody's field. And they don't last long. So fish screens prevent that. They help keep fish in the stream where they belong, not in the ditches. And so in this particular case, the landowner got a more modern irrigation system and the fish got a chance. The other thing you need to do is protect riparian zones. I mean, riparian zones are 5%. These are the vegetation next to streams. It's so lush because there's so much water there. They're 5% of the landscape, but they hold 95% of the species. And so they're critical. And they tend to get overgrazed. But there are ways of fixing that. You can graze on a schedule that actually is beneficial to riparian areas. You can bring cattle in, get them out quickly at certain times of the year. And you can manage a riparian zone. And sometimes, you know, revegetation, you tend to think of, let's go on a planting project and plant a bunch of willows and other veg. But sometimes it's just a function of putting up a fence. And in this case, it's a 3-wire electric fence to keep, this is on our ranch, to keep our cows out of this particular riparian area, or to manage the grazing in that riparian area. So I guess the point here is that restoration takes multiple forms. It might be replacing, you know, we tend to think of actually working in the stream itself, but usually it's removing whatever the stressor on the stream is. You have to do that first, because otherwise there's no point restoring the stream if you haven't taken away whatever the stressor was. So the stressor could be something like a culvert that doesn't pass fish. This is a culvert that does pass fish. It's been reconstructed so that it has a natural bottom instead of a metal bottom. Restoration can take the form of piping a ditch so that you're not losing a lot of water. This ditch water is not seeping to groundwater, and so you can keep 2 or 3 CFS in the stream. Or it might be just good old-fashioned planting vegetation along a hammered stream bank, as these Deer Lodge High School students are doing. So the upside of this kind of restoration work is that it also builds resilience for climate change. If temperatures increase as the global climate models predict, we can probably expect lower flows in summer. We can probably expect perhaps flashier flows in the springtime. And streams that are already in bad conditions aren't going to fare very well, nor are the ecosystems that are associated with them. And the Upper Clark Fork is important because they also say that species, terrestrial species, mammals, that need colder climates may migrate north, or they may migrate up in elevation. So if you look at the position of the Upper Clark Fork River here, it's a link between this huge wilderness area of the Selway and the River of No Return in Idaho, between this huge wilderness in the greater Yellowstone region. It's a conduit and it's a corridor to this crown of the continent, which extends up into Canada. And so restoring the Clark Fork, and particularly the Upper Clark Fork, I think has a lot of significance for the future. It's not just a local phenomenon. So this is a quote that I'm sure you've seen more times than you can count, and it's one that people who work perhaps in the social sciences say, well, of course it's important for people, but I think environmentalists tend to forget that part. And if you're doing restoration of the type that we're talking about in the Upper Clark Fork, it's all on private lands. It's all with local families. And so, building community and working with people has been the most critical and truthfully the most rewarding, I think, part of our job in the Upper Clark Fork. Because none of the work that we do would happen without the community up there. And so it's exciting. We work with a local watershed group made up primarily of ranchers, the Watershed Restoration Coalition. They sent out a survey to their members and they said, what are your biggest resource concerns? What are you most concerned about on your property? And fish came in dead last. Weeds came in first. But water quality ranked pretty high. And I've heard ranchers say that, there's one guy in particular who says, yeah, I don't really care about fish, but I do know that if there aren't any in my stream, I'm doing something wrong. I'm managing my land. There's some problem with the way I'm managing my land. So I know that's not right. And so, there's the rancher who will come to one of your meetings and say, yeah, sorry, I'm late. I had to fish all those damn bull trout out of my ditch. But in reality, they do, they care. They care about the landscape that they ranch on. When we've worked with large groups of landowners in the Upper Clark Fork, we ask them, what is your vision? You're about to get this huge, super fun cleanup, restoration. But, you should start thinking about what you want your valley to look like. And it was one of those kind of touchy-feely exercises where, people talk about visioning what they want their watershed to look like after cleanup was done. And they said, we want it to be open and agricultural. Basically, we want it to look like it does now, but we want better opportunity for our kids. And we want the same thing. So part of working with people is also to recognize the communities up there. And I haven't talked about this, but this is a whole nother presentation, and it's a really important one. The communities of Butte, Anaconda, and Opportunity have to be clean and healthy for the whole watershed to be fixed. And there are ways from getting there. They have their own super fun processes. It's been long, it's been frustrating. There have been little bits of cleanup, but they still haven't decided on the final, what the final fix is going to be in Butte. It's almost hard to imagine, but that's still, that cleanup is still in flux. And likewise at Opportunity, where most of the sediments in the basin from Milltown, from Silverbow Creek, and from the Clark Fork River, as well as some from Butte and Anaconda, are being concentrated in this one area. And so that also remains to be finished and cleaned. It will be the final repository for all that stuff, but it needs to be at least remediated so that people can use it and so that contaminants are not affecting people's health. So if you were to delete all of the slides from the middle of the talk and just answer the question at the beginning, how to make the Clark Fork clean, healthy, and whole, I could have just skipped to this slide because really what it takes is a whole host of partners. And none of this work, and in fact none of this presentation, would have been possible without help from all of the staff at the Clark Fork Coalition. Matt Vincent from Clark Fork Watershed Education Program contributed a number of the slides on Silverbow Creek, And then there's this sort of unsung alphabet soup of groups, agencies, funding organizations that we work with all the time, every day. It really is a huge partnership. Also our members and ranchers in the Upper Clark Fork. So as Pat Williams has said, the opportunity out there is huge, and it's a chance to do a big one right in the West, and we certainly hope it goes that way. And that's it. Questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that repository and opportunity and what, if any, how are they coming on isolating all of those opportunities to keep another big problem on that?
Well, yeah, so the question was, what is going to happen to with the repository at Opportunity? And they are in the process of capping it. The plan for that repository is to put 2 feet of clean material on top and vegetate it. They also have some groundwater pump back systems on the outer fringe of it. The idea with the vegetative cap is to prevent water from infiltrating through. So, the Milltown sediments were taken up there thinking that they might grow something, and that was a miserable failure. They now have a plan for fixing that, and that plan is going to involve treating about the upper 6 inches and then putting 18 inches of clean fill on top of that. And that's actually scheduled to start this spring. So, but long term, it is a repository. It is where everything stays. And it's such a huge volume that you can't dig it up, you can't line it. And so the vegetative cap is, will that be good for for in perpetuity? We don't know. But at this point, it's as much as probably you can do. It will be monitored in perpetuity as well. But yeah, it's a legacy to our mining past, and it's not a happy legacy by any means. Yeah.
Why weren't they all put in the Berkeley pit? Why didn't the trains go a little further and put it in the Berkeley pit? Because you're downstream from Opportunity.
Right.
And if it's going to be there, instead of in the Berkeley pit, has anybody considered putting up a very large boulder that has engraved on it, look out, don't ever do anything here. Like the Japanese did about the tsunami, they had rocks way out there and said, don't build beyond this rock. Is there any way that we could finish this and not leave that huge pipe next to Opportunity?
Well, the problem with that is that, as you know, the Berkeley pit is filling up with water. The water, if you were to put all those sediments in there, would overflow. Right now, there's a plan where once the water reaches the level of the alluvial aquifer, if it were allowed to reach that level, it would enter the alluvial aquifer and flow into Silverbow Creek. We can't let that happen. So there's a treatment plant built to start treating water once water gets close to that level. So you don't, the Berkeley pit is a huge problem by itself, but unfortunately you can't compound it by adding sediments into the pit. That would be an even bigger disaster than what we have now. Yeah.
You mentioned a rancher's willingness to relinquish a water right, it seemed, when irrigation technology was sort of, or a better technology was given to them, or they were able to purchase or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you find that the ranching community is willing to do that, or is there any tendency to want to hold on to water rights?
Oh, there's always a tendency to want to hold on to water rights. It's, a water right is a property right, and they're sacred. But in some cases, a rancher realizes that they can switch from something like flood to pivot. It's less work, because flood, you're always out there futzing with the little dams to get the water to go in the right place, and so it's very labor intensive. Pivot is much simpler. So it costs them some in energy, but they end up not using their full water right, and so the part that they don't use has value. And if they sell it, they can, they can pay for their pivot, or they can make extra money for their operation that they didn't have before. So it's ultimately an economic decision, just like most of them. So yeah, people, there are lots of, that's just one example, but there are lots and lots of different ways of doing water deals. It's not always, sometimes it's a lease, sometimes it's an outright acquisition. Leases are, of course, more temporary. Yeah, in the back.
Is there any concern in switching from the irrigation to pivot of trade-off in surface water and groundwater quality?
Is there any trade-off between switching from ditches to?
Instead of depleting a surface water resource, groundwater?
Yeah, that's one of the things that the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation makes us look at when we do a water lease, is we have to demonstrate, we have to see if there is anybody downstream who might be affected by taking water that was formerly in a ditch, say, and piping that water, because now that seepage is not going into the ground. There might be somebody with a well downstream. We have to show that their water level that their well would not be adversely impacted. So yeah, there are always questions like that, and it can be tricky, because we tend to be used to the landscape the way it is now, but it's often the way it is now because of decades of irrigation practices. You have, wetlands that are there because of leaking ditches, just as one example. Yeah.
Was there any concerns with the area in between the two cleanup sites recontaminating downstream?
Yeah, that's a really common question. And the answer is, probably not. It seems, intuitively you would think, well, why would you clean up the area downstream if you've got all this contamination still sitting up there upstream? So it's a reasonable thing to ask. But when the sediment is mobilized by floods, we said before that the worst stuff was up at the headwaters. It got more diluted by clean sediments as it came downstream. Well, now we no longer have this huge source that we had in 1908. That source has gone away. And what we have now is so distributed through the floodplain that even if it were remobilized, it would mix so much with cleaner sediments that you wouldn't see a big change in concentrations by the time you got to Milltown. And so, yeah, in a perfect world, you'd probably work from top to bottom, but you would need a pretty big flood to mobilize that much sediment, and in a flood that big, then you're mixing in from the tributaries, and so the concentrations of the sediments that you're left with just is going to be, more dilute than you would expect. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
With a project this big, there's always the possibility of unintended consequences. After you've done all your removal, restoration, and things in the bulldozers and the home, who's going to have, or is anybody going to have responsibility for monitoring and managing the system thereafter?
Yes, it's a good question. And that is critical. ARCO, which is now owned by British Petroleum, is still on the hook, essentially in perpetuity, whatever that means. But there are, EPA holds them to 5-year reviews, and so every 5 years, they're monitoring in the in-between time too, but every 5 years there's a review and an analysis of, is this fix working or not? And if it's not, they can go back and change something. So yeah, it continues. It doesn't, it seems like everybody's gone home. Certainly the backhoes have gone home, but it continues. Yeah.
What do you see for the future for Warm Springs ponds? Or is there any solution besides liming them in perpetuity to keep the ponds, but yet cleanse the metals out?
That's a really good question. And I don't know. I mean, the final disposition of the ponds isn't settled yet by any means, and they're not going to, I think, even think about it until Silverbow Creek is finished. So just for reference, the question was about Warm Springs Ponds, and those are the ponds that Silverbow Creek flows into. The water is treated with lime before it's sent downstream and into the Clark Fork River. So those ponds are active sort of wildlife sites too. They're lots of fish, lots of birds. They're really popular for hunting and fishing. And yet they're treatment ponds. So people are, and you know, they're important for wildlife too, because it's part of a, you know, for birds, I think it's part of a major migratory corridor. I mean, you work for Fish, Wildlife and Parks, so you probably know more about that than I do, but it, you know, I think they're important ecologically as well. So what would they do with them? I mean, one option would be to abandon them, let them dry up, put the creek, you know, back into the creek and not have them go through the ponds. But just because of the constituency that the ponds enjoy, both from wildlife and from people, I'm not sure I see that happening politically. But it's a really good question. Yeah?
You said that the cutthroat are returning to Silverbow Creek, but have the bull trout return?
No bull trout in Silverbow Creek, or did somebody, I'm trying to remember now. I don't think Matt talked about one, yeah, I think it was only cutthroat. Somehow I was having this thought that maybe there was one, but I don't think so. I think it's just the cutthroat so far. There are bull trout, however, in Warm Springs Creek, which if fish come down Warm Springs Creek and can swim back up Silverbow Creek, they could end up there eventually, but they haven't yet. Yeah?
Has Fish, Wildlife and Parks included that fishery kind of throughout the system, the Blackfoot and everything is improving now?
You know, Vicki, I'm not as familiar with what the counts are in the Blackfoot. I know that in the Milltown area, counts were up, although they're at least, you know, varying sort of the same everywhere around that area. But I did just hear a talk about the upper Clark Fork where they've been radio tagging fish, and there's still major mortality in the upper Clark Fork River, particularly in Reach A, which is, you know, upstream of Garrison. So that's, you know, the reach we've been talking about. 50% of the fish still die in that reach, and primarily they die in the spring during runoff, and that's when the metals concentrations are highest. And so there's still, you know, the fishery there has not, even though, you know, bookends are good, but that part of the river is not cleaned up yet, and it shows. The fishery is still a fifth of what it should be. Yeah?
Are there any threats to water quality from past mining activity in the Blackfoot River?
There are at the very headwaters. Yeah, the question was threats to the Blackfoot from mining activity. And the Mike Horse mine is at the headwaters of the Blackfoot, and that is a dam that is built out of tailings. It's got a bunch of tailings behind it, and it blew out in 1975 and contaminated much of the upper Clark Fork. There's currently, DEQ is currently trying to figure out how to fix that. And that's, again, not an easy thing to figure out, because where do you put this? Where do you put the tailings? It's at the headwaters. Everything is steep or wet, and there are very few good repository sites. One that they're considering is close enough to a private landowner that that may not work either.
Is there a responsible party for that?
There was, yeah, although that was a SARCO. The responsible party settled with the state of Montana in a bankruptcy case, and so the state of Montana now holds the $40 million. That's exactly how much money they have to spend. They don't have any more than that, so they need to find a solution that works within that $40 million. But the state of Montana did get that money to do that cleanup, we hope.
Because restoration is kind of a desirable career probably for lots of students in the classroom, can you, Chris, talk a little bit about who's doing the actual restoration work and how that goes about?
You know, the restoration work is so varied. You know, as I said before, I think students who study restoration at university are studying probably, you know, stream ecology and geomorphology and, you know, and that type of thing. But in reality, a whole bunch of the type of work we do are things like piping ditches and, you know, figuring out doing a cost-benefit analysis for pivot versus flood, doing culvert replacement. And so it tends to involve, you know, it involves science, but it also involves some engineering skills, some basic business sense. When you actually, you know, if you actually have the opportunity to get in and fix a stream, those entities tend to be consultants. The people who figure out what need to be done can be consultants. They can be people from the agencies. For example, someone from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or someone from a watershed group like ours, or someone from NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. So yeah, it's agencies, it's private consulting firms, and it's watershed groups. But yeah, restoration out in the world tends to be extremely varied. And yeah, a lot of it has to do with putting up fence and replacing culverts. There are questions? One more in back.
Are there projections of whether the fish will be edible?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Are there any projections of whether the fish will be edible?
Oh, they are, yeah, they are edible. With respect to arsenic or metals, yeah, they're not a problem that way. The only advisory that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has for fish in the Upper Clark Fork is for mercury, and that has to do more from some historic mining, probably in the Flint Creek area, also from aerial deposition. You know, mercury from power plants, you know, on the other side of the world drifts over here. We see it in alpine, you know, wilderness lakes, but it also affects waters in the Clark Fork. Well, if there's nothing else, thanks for your attention.